Good morning, and thank you for the introduction. I also thank you for the invitation and opportunity to join you this morning and spend a few minutes talking about product quality considerations for emergency use authorizations. Again, my name is Wendy Wilson-Lee, and I am a Division Director in the Office of New Drug Products located in the Office of Pharmaceutical Quality here in CDER. So before we jump into the presentation around what the expectations are for EUAs, I wanted to pause and take a minute to make sure that everybody in the audience is familiar with who we are here in the Office of Pharmaceutical Quality, or OPQ as we are also known. I know that most folks think of us when they think about the chemistry, manufacturing, and controls portion of the submission, but it's a little bit more than that, at least from our perspective. And so, when you think about a quality product of any kind, it consistently meets the expectation of the user. And we here in OPQ would argue that drugs are no different in that regard. Patients expect safe and effective medicines with every dose they take, and I think, in addition to patients, their family members, their prescribers, their healthcare professionals also have that same expectation. And so when you think about pharmaceutical quality, it's our job to assure that every dose is safe and effective, and that it's also free of contamination and defects. And so this quality is what gives patients, and as I talked about, also their families and their doctors and the nurses who are caring for them, it gives all of us confidence that the next dose of medicine is going to be the same as the last dose that they just took. And that's what quality, especially from a product quality perspective, is all about. No pun intended there. So we here in OPQ take this very seriously, and we work together in one quality voice. That's the slogan of our organization, and we do that for the patients. But it's also important for everybody to also recognize that we here in OPQ are also patients too. So while we may do it for ourselves just a little bit, it truly is our public health mission to make sure that all of the products that are used to support the American public are safe, are effective, and are also made with the utmost quality. And so that's who we are here in OPQ. And hopefully the next time you think about us, you don't just think about the CMC section of the submission, but think of us as the stewards of product quality for the American public. So today we have one simple objective, and that's for us to talk about what are the product quality considerations, or at least a few of them, when you're thinking about your EUA submission. And so I know that there's been tons of talks already about what are EUAs, etc. So just wanted to pause and make sure that we all have the foundational understanding that these EUAs and the authority that grants them allows us here at FDA to help strengthen the nation's public health protections against chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear threats, including infectious diseases, which we're seeing here with the pandemic. And we do this by facilitating the availability and use of medical countermeasures that are needed during these public health emergencies. So as an example, we have talked a little bit, I'm sure, in the previous sessions about all the strategies that FDA has brought to bear in terms of COVID-19. And so in terms of the EUAs, there have been several large categories or buckets of EUAs that have been authorized to help fight in this pandemic. And some of these products come from vaccines or the biological therapeutics, as well as authorizations for medical devices. And here in CDER, we've been working on EUAs for drug therapeutics to combat this COVID-19 pandemic. And so the agency is bringing its full force to meet and address this public health emergency, and we will continue to work on this as long as required. And so with that foundation, we'll start switching gears a little bit and talk a little bit more specifically about what are some of the product quality considerations for an EUA. So first and foremost, before we get into the nuts and bolts of this, I just want to say, I think the most important key message to take away from this is that we, the agency, encourage early interaction when you're even thinking about or beginning to plan an EUA submission. It is critical to the success of your submission because it allows us to have some very fruitful discussions and to get on the same page about what strategies might be or what the components of your submission are going to be. And so we do encourage you to come in and talk to us when you begin your planning about what the submission is going to be. I think it can only help to strengthen and make your EUA submission stronger. So in terms of what these pre-EUA activities might include, you can have discussions with us about potential product itself, what you're thinking about using and what those indications might be. We can talk about the best way to submit your information prior to a formal submission. Are there other ways to get that in front of us so that we can take a look at it before you get to the final EUA submission? And then also to talk about what that formal submission, what the contents of that submission might be. So these are just a few of the examples of things that we might be able to talk about. But certainly if there are other topics or other concerns or questions that you or your development team might have, we encourage you to also bring those up in any of your pre-EUA discussions. We are happy to engage and to discuss and share with you our thoughts about what those topics might be. And we here in OPQ are no different. We strongly encourage you to come in and talk to us, specifically if you have products that might incorporate new novel strategies or novel components. It's always good to come in and talk about so that we can kind of iron out maybe some of the issues or potential hurdles or challenges that might come up during the review. If we've had some time to chat about it prior to you submitting the formal submission, there might be ways for you to mitigate some of those risks as you get ready to submit your formal submission. So when we think about, what might some of these novel strategies or components be from a product quality perspective, a few things come to mind. And the first one would be if your product is going to be administered via a new dosage form, you'd want to come in and talk to us about that to make sure that we are in agreement about what that control strategy might be. What is it going to be called? A lot of things that we would probably need to come to an agreement on. So new dosage forms is one example. New manufacturing technologies is another example. Again, thinking about control strategy, wanting to make sure that we've got all the process understanding and the testing strategy, et cetera, that you would need to support that manufacturing technology and its submission under the EUA. Also, if your dosage form is going to incorporate new components, a new excipient to modulate release or to enhance absorption, whatever that might be. Maybe you're using a new packaging material, a new type of glass, a new type of plastic. All of those kind of things would be important to come and have a conversation with us about to make sure that we can get a good understanding of what you're proposing and to provide you any guidance or advice that we might have about data or information that would need to be submitted to support its use under the EUA. New analytical procedures is another example. We also encourage people to make sure that you're using the best analytical procedures to ensure quality. And so if you've come up with a new analytical technique or a new way of testing, we'd love for you to come in and talk to us about that as well. And finally, one that maybe people don't often think about, but we would also consider this important to have discussions about, would be a new data analysis strategy. If you're proposing modeling or anything of that nature, or if you're going against what is typically considered common for your data analysis, we definitely encourage you to come in and talk to us about that to make sure that you are putting together the best data package to support your submission. So again, these are just a couple of examples of novel strategies. By no means is this the end-all be-all list. And so if there are other new or novel things that you are thinking about as you're innovating, please feel free to contact us and come in and talk about that. So again, we want to make sure that we come to agreements about what that data package is going to need to have in it to support its issuance and use under the EUA. So now that we've kind of talked a little bit about what you want to think about pre-EUA, now we're starting to get into and start planning the actual submission itself. And so in terms of putting together your submission, you want to make sure that your EUA includes sufficient relevant information supported by data to assure the identity, strength, quality, and purity of the proposed product. This is no different than any other submission that comes our way. It may be flexibilities that are afforded because it is under an emergency use authorization, but it is still a requirement for the product itself to meet these standards for identity, strength, quality, and purity. And so for some products under an EUA, you might be able to incorporate this information via right of reference. Let's say that you have a drug master file for your drug substance or for one of your excipient components or your packaging. Or you're using an approved product in a new use, and so you have letters of authorization to the new drug application where the CMC information resides. All of these can be used to help put together your submission. And again, we encourage you to come and talk to us about what this submission strategy might be to make sure that you've got all the appropriate right of references that you need to support your submission. So when we think about products that come in for EUA authorization, they fall into one of two buckets. They're either approved products and you're coming in for a new use that is not currently approved, or they are completely new products that we haven't seen before and they're unapproved. And so from a product quality perspective, when we think about these two buckets of candidates, there are unique anticipated areas of concern that are unique to each bucket. And over the next couple of slides, we're going to spend a couple of minutes going over what some of those focus areas might be to make sure that you have at least a little bit of knowledge about some focus areas for your submission. So the first bucket that we're going to spend some time talking about is going to be your currently marketed or approved product that you are submitting for a new use under an EUA. And so when you think about that, I'll pause here for a second to give you a moment to come up with what might be some anticipated areas of concern. What could change under this EUA in your new use that you didn't provide for or have coverage for under your current marketed application? So some examples of things that might pop up include a new packaging configuration. So for example, your currently marketed product is available in bottles, but in order to provide ease of administration at the point of use for the patient, you might need to switch to blisters. And what does that mean for the quality of the product? Do we now have new stability concerns because maybe we don't have the same protection that is provided by the bottle? Is there a new impurity that might form because of the new contact materials that weren't currently used in the bottle versus the blister? A whole host of things that could come up around the new packaging configuration. But this is just one example. Another would be scale up of manufacturing. And that's coupled with your ability to supply sufficient product to meet the demands. Now that you have your approved use and you're adding a new use under the EUA, do you have sufficient capacity to meet your demands? And if you don't, what do you have to do to get there? Does it require you to scale up your manufacturing process? Do you have to bring on more sites for manufacturing? All of these kind of considerations for your approved product would be areas of concern under the new use and the EUA. And so you will want to make sure that you're addressing these potential concerns in your submission. Another example would be compatibility considerations. So your currently marketed product is approved for swallowing whole as a tablet, but because of your new use, it may require administration to pediatric populations or to patients who have difficulty swallowing. And so how are we going to get there? It requires some form of manipulation, whether it be crushing or preparing a suspension in order to administer under the EUA. And so there was no in-use stability or compatibility data provided in your original or the original marketing application. And so that would need to be addressed in your EUA submission. So that's a gap that would need to be filled with information and data. And so again, these are just some examples of anticipated areas of concern if you're coming in with an approved product for a new use. By no means is this the end of the list. I'm sure there are many others, and maybe many of you came up with examples as you were thinking. But make sure that you do that kind of assessment when you're completing your submission and putting it together to make sure that those gaps in information can be covered by the data, justification, and information that you submit in your EUA submission. So we've talked a little bit about some examples of anticipated areas of concern for the approved products, and now we're going to switch gears and talk a little bit about what some examples of these areas of concern might be for unapproved products. I'll give you a moment to come up with a couple of examples in your own head, and hopefully what pops up for you will be something similar to what I will share with you in this slide. So the first example that we'll talk about is inadequate drug substance characterization. You may not have time to do the full suite of characterization studies on your drug substance. And so there'll be an area of concern around whether or not you truly understand what it is that your process produces, and do you have an adequate control strategy to make sure that you can ensure that it reproducibly comes up and produces that drug substance each and every time. Another example might be You don't have enough time to generate the usual stability data package that we're used to seeing that supports approval. And so how can we ensure that you have established a viable retest period and a viable expiration period that is appropriate to assure the quality of your product over the use time? And so you would want to make sure that you're leveraging multiple data sources if you have them available for similar studies on similar products, or you want to make sure that you have appropriate justifications or modeling techniques, myriad of things that you could apply to make sure that the retest period and expiration period that you propose for your product under the EUA makes sense and are viable and are capable of ensuring quality over the use period. And so again, we encourage you to come in and talk to us, especially for unapproved products, around what the stability data package might need to look like. Another anticipated area of concern for unapproved products would be haven't had enough time to really understand or develop good process or product understanding. And so maybe you don't have a full scope around what is truly critical for the quality of your product. Again, does that mean you now have to go to a more conservative testing strategy? Do you rely on additional testing in process to assure quality? Again, these are all things that you would want to make sure that are addressed in your submission so that we have a confidence that whatever you are proposing, your control strategy will be sufficient to assure the identity, strength, purity, quality at the end. And one final example coupled with that would be maybe you don't have enough time to fully develop a whole suite of analytical procedures. So again, another area that you want to make sure that you address in the submission, that the information that you provide demonstrates to us that the overall control strategy is capable of assuring the quality of the product. So as you're pulling together your submission, it might be useful to think about what are some of the questions that we on the review team might be asking ourselves as you prepare your submission to make sure that the information you provide is sufficient to answer those questions. And so a couple of examples of some key questions that come up and you want to make sure you address in your submission, they include who will manufacture the drug substance and drug product. That's very important for us to know who's actually making it. And how are they making it? Can you describe for us what the drug substance synthesis process is going to be and what the drug product manufacturing process is going to be? And what exactly are you putting in it? Do you know the components of your drug product? So these are just some examples of questions. And on the next slide, there's a couple of more examples. So what characterization data do you have that confirms that you're actually making what you set out to make and reaching your target? What is the overall control strategy to ensure the quality of the product? I've talked a lot about overall control strategy, and that is one of the key critical elements that you need to make sure is laid out very well in the submission, because it is our job to make sure that whatever you're putting out there on the market is going to be safe, effective, and meets the appropriate standard of quality. And so your overall control strategy is vitally important to assuring that. And how will it be packaged or administered? Having a good understanding and making sure that your submission addresses some of these key questions will definitely help to make sure that we have the information that we need when we're doing our assessment. So what are some tips that I can share with you to kind of help you make sure that you give us what we're looking for when it's time to assess your EUA? The first one that I can lay out for you is just make sure that you describe the drug product. Make sure that you include information on the drug substance, the excipients, the packaging, any co-administered or co-packaged components. All of that should be described in your EUA submission. Include the qualitative and the quantitative compositions of your product. It's very important for us to know what's in it and how much is in it. Be sure to include information on any delivery or dosing devices that they're appropriate for your product, and include information on the quantity of finished product that you have on hand and your capacity for how much you can make. With respect to manufacturing and testing sites, make sure that you list all proposed as well as any potential sites that might be involved in the manufacture of your drug substance or drug product. And be sure to outline for us what the responsibilities are going to be at each of these sites. You want to make sure that you give us information for sites involved in the critical intermediates, the drug substance, the drug product, the final packaging and labeling, and any sites that are involved in testing. So in addition to knowing who is making and what their responsibilities are going to be, it's also important for us to know where these sites are located. So be sure to identify clearly for us sites that are U.S. sites as well as sites that may be non-U.S. sites. You don't have to have only U.S. sites for an EUA submission, but clearly identify for us which ones are internal U.S. sites and which ones might be international or foreign facilities. In addition to the location of the sites, it's also important for us to have a good understanding of the site's current cGMP status. So if you have that information, if you can provide that in the submission, that's very helpful for us. In terms of our assessment, we will absolutely do our own assessment of the proposed and potential manufacturing sites, but it's also good to have an understanding of your understanding of the GMP status of the sites that you're including in your EUA. And then in addition, also, as I talked about earlier, make sure you include information on the capacity of your sites, as well as any surge capabilities that these manufacturing or testing or packaging labeling sites might have, just in case we find ourselves in an increase for demand. Will you be able to meet that? That information is really helpful in our assessment as we move through it. We talked a little bit about this already, but making sure that you describe in the submission how you actually synthesize the drug substance and how do you manufacture the drug product. Be sure to include information on your controls for critical steps, your in-process test, and as I talked about previously, your ability to scale the process if needed. This information, again, is important for us to make sure that we have a good understanding that you know what is critical to control your process to ensure the quality at the end of the day. As part of your overall control strategy, I'm sure there's going to be testing and specifications, and so in your EUA submission, be sure to lay out for us what those specifications are going to be for the drug substance and the drug product, as well as your components, especially critical excipients, etc. And then also provide any batch analysis results that you might have for your drug substance, drug product, etc. Providing information on the analytical procedures and how they're done, then, that would be very helpful, as well as your justification for your testing strategy. So talk about the tests that are included in your specifications, but don't forget to also address any tests that you omit or leave out. It's important for us to understand that you've considered them and that you have sufficient justification for why you are not testing for an attribute, especially if we might deem it to be critical to quality. So don't forget to just to make sure you address the omission of tests in your submission if it's applicable, in addition to the tests that are provided in the specification. Sterile products always have a little bit more information required for them, and so don't forget to make sure that your control strategy also ensures sterility assurance. You want to make sure that you provide the appropriate required validation information, especially for those sterility assuring unit operations and steps. You want to provide information on your testing procedures for sterility as well as your results. And you also want to make sure that you include any information on container closure integrity testing. And we talked a little bit about this, but in terms of the stability data, make sure you give us what you've got. That's the tip that I can give you. Give us all that you have. The more the better. It never hurts. And make sure you define for us what your recommended storage conditions are going to be for the product and the drug substance. It's also important to note that if you have manipulations of your product prior to administration, you need to include that in-use stability data and the recommended in-use storage conditions for your product. Vitally important, because it's not just about the quality of the product while it is in the packaging, it's also about ensuring the quality of the product when it's being administered to the patient. So in-use stability data, if it is applicable for your product, don't forget to address it and include it in your submission. And as we talked about, defining the retest period for your drug substance and the expiration dating period for your drug product. But also don't forget, if you've got co-packaged diluents or vehicles for administration, make sure that we've got stability and expiration dating information for those co-packaged components as well. And it's important to include in your submission the labels and all the other labeling, and make sure that those components have all of the product quality information that is required. And if you have instructions for administration or instructions for handling, make sure that your submission includes and addresses that information as well. Also, don't forget to include instructions for preparation. Again, if you have a product that needs to be manipulated prior to administration, be sure to include information on how that is to happen. If you need to specify different preparations for different populations, i.e. adults versus pediatric, make sure you do that in your submission. And one example would be dissolve X milligrams of the product in X mils of diluent to reconstitute. This is the kind of information that should be provided in the submission, and you should have data to support and justify the instructions for preparation that are being proposed. Another point to not forget is that if you have a combination product, such as a drug-device combination, we also encourage you to come in and talk to us because these are really complicated products and we want to make sure that your submission strategy meets the needs of all the parties that are going to be assessing your submission. And we want to make sure that the information that you're submitting is going to be relevant to all the centers that will be involved. And so your data that is required to support your EUA may differ based on the contribution of each one of those constituent parts to the overall combination product. So again, I cannot emphasize enough, if you are developing or thinking about developing a combination product for an EUA submission, come in and talk to us and make sure that you have all the relevant centers involved in that discussion so that you have a good understanding of what each group might need from you in that submission in order for us to do an assessment. So I've shared with you, a couple of the product quality considerations when it comes to putting together a submission for EUAs. Hopefully you have found this helpful. And I've laid out for you a couple of the strategies, the anticipated areas of concern, as well as some tips to help put together a really good submission. But at the end of the day, if you remember nothing else, there are 2 points that I want to make sure that you walk away with. First, hopefully based on this presentation, you have seen that the product quality considerations for an EUA, they don't differ that much compared to what we usually want to see for any other development programs. And so again, there may be flexibilities in terms of extent and amount of information required, but you still need to make sure that you're addressing the same key target areas. And again, think about those questions that are key and critical. Who makes it? How do they make it? What do they put it in? Where are they located? If you kind of apply that newsroom mentality to the submission, answering the critical 5 whys, or 5 W's, I should say, you'll be in pretty good stead to have a really good submission. And the other critical quality component of this submission, of this presentation today, come and talk to us early and often if you're thinking about coming in with the EUA. Again, the more that we can talk up front, it will only increase and improve the quality of your submission for your candidate product. So the considerations aren't that different for EUAs, and we really do strongly encourage you to come and talk to us if you're thinking about submitting an EUA. So we're at that point of the presentation where we want to make sure that I actually taught you something. So we are here for the knowledge check. And here's our first question. New molecular entities cannot be submitted for consideration under an EUA. True or false? I'll give you a couple of seconds to think about what your answer is. We definitely touched upon this in the presentation. Can you come in with an EUA for a new molecular entity? Yes, you can. So the answer to this question is false. An EUA for a new molecular entity can be submitted provided the appropriate data and information are included. So yes, you can submit an NME for an EUA for consideration. And one more question, just to make sure that you didn't sleep through half of my presentation. Products authorized under an EUA can only be manufactured in the United States. True or false? We definitely touched upon this during the presentation as well. Give you a couple of seconds to pick your answer. And the answer to this one is false as well. Domestic and foreign facilities are allowed under an EUA, provided that they meet all other requirements. So yes, you can have domestic and foreign facilities in an EUA submission. Slide with a couple of resources. I'm sure that these have been mentioned before, but More information about our guidance and what EUAs and the authorities that support them can be found in our guidance for industry and other stakeholders, emergency use authorization, medical products, and related authorities. And if you're looking for the latest and greatest information about the COVID-19 EUAs, you can go to our FDA website and find that information there. If you have inquiries or questions for OPQ and don't quite know where to go within the organization, here's a one-stop shop that'll get you a response: CDER-OPQ-inquiries at fda.hhs.gov. Please contact us. We are happy to help. And with that, that is the end of my presentation. If you have questions for me, be sure to type them in the Q&A pod. Please reference me, Wendy Wilson-Lee, if your question is directed to me, to make sure that I answer it during our live Q&A panel. And I look forward to talking to you then. And I appreciate your time and attention and your willingness to listen to me talk a little bit about the product quality considerations for emergency use authorizations. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Wilson-Lee, for your presentation and taking time out of your day. And we have a lot of questions for you already. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started with the first one. So Dr. Wilson-Lee, where can we find submission content and format for an EUA? How is the content format different than a typical NDA or a BLA submission?
So thanks for the question. And actually, I am not aware that we have a template that is out for public facing, but the tip that I can give you in terms of submission, how to structure it, is following the ECTD. If you're used to having your submission structured in that manner, would be perfectly fine. Otherwise, that may be a topic that you would want to come in and have a conversation with us in OPQ to make sure that we can give you some guidance around how to best put your submission together to make sure that we'll be able to find everything that we're looking for. So thanks for the question.
All right, thank you. And our next question for you. Is it mandatory to comply with the USP monographs for excipients used in drug products, even though they assure the quality using the European Pharmacopoeia?
So our gold standard would be the USP monograph. However, if you have an alternative standard that you are applying for your testing and compliance, you would need to make sure that you address that in your submission. And so what you would want to do is to provide a copy of the actual European Pharmacopoeia or whatever other pharmacopoeia that you're using, a copy of the monograph, and then provide us with a comparison or evaluation about how that alternative compendial standard provides either equal or better assurance of quality. And so you would want to make sure that you lay all of that out in your submission if you do not plan on using the USP monograph as your standard for reference. Thanks for the question.
Great, thank you, Dr. Wilson-Lee. And we have another one for you. Does the EUA submission need to include DS and DP process validation results?
So the tip here would be to make sure that you would follow the same process validation requirements that you would for the actual NDA submission. As you know, for different types of submissions, thinking of a BLA, there are different requirements compared to the NDA. And so the tip that I would say is that if process validation information would be required for your NDA, and I'm thinking about sterile products in particular, you want to make sure that those requirements are met under the EUA. And then per normal, we would look at any other validation strategies, et cetera, during an inspection. Thank you for the question.
Great, thank you. And we have more questions for you. When should a sponsor approach the FDA to discuss the EUA? Is prior to an end of phase 2 meeting too early?
So I don't think I can emphasize this enough. I think as early as possible to come in and talk to us, especially if you have some of those aspects of the application that I talked about in my presentation, things that maybe are a bit not normal or novel in your submission. We would definitely want to have conversations. And it doesn't mean that we would have just one. It may require us to have several discussions as your development evolves and as new things come up that you need to get guidance and feedback on. So I would say as early as you feel that you can, at least for us, be able to describe your plans in terms of what the product is going to be, how you're going to manufacture it, what sites might be available. As soon as you can answer some of those key fundamental questions, I would encourage you to come in and have a conversation with us. Thanks for the question.
Great, thank you, Dr. Wilson-Lee. And we have another one for you from our audience. Should the testing site for excipients be used in a specific, or should the testing site for excipients used in a specific product be included in the file? If this testing site will change, will this trigger a variation?
Right. So very similar to the requirements for reporting changes to approved products. If you were to change any relevant aspects of your CMC strategy, whether that be adding new sites, if you were to have significant changes to your manufacturing process, all of those things would need to be discussed with the agency prior to those changes being implemented. And we would need to make sure that we all are on one accord and in agreement that what you're proposing would not cause significant changes in the overall quality of the product. And so we would have an expectation that any changes would be reported to us. And we would encourage you to talk to us even after EUA issuance. If you have thoughts about what those plans might be, if we could lay those out early, it would be beneficial to both parties. But certainly there is an expectation that you would notify us if you plan to change anything and be different than what was agreed upon under the EUA at the time of issuance. Thanks for the question.
Okay, great. Thank you for that explanation. And our next question, are on-site inspections of manufacturing facilities required under an EUA?
So the inspection issue, I'm sure, is one that's a hot topic for folks, and especially with the restrictions and complications that COVID has caused us. We have employed a varied different techniques for inspections. What I will say to this, though, is that we will do an assessment based on the sites that you list to ensure that those sites are capable, based on our standard, to provide product quality assurance. And so that would be our usual evaluation of, whether or not there's any prior inspectional history. Have we been there before? Is there an ability for us to leverage possibly inspections from some of our sister agencies, thinking of those in EUA, in the EMA, et cetera, if we have mutual recognition established. And then also, if this is a brand new site, we would have to carefully think about how do we do that evaluation to make sure that we have a full scope understanding about the quality management system and whether or not that site is ready for production. So again, can't say surely that for certain on-site inspections are required, but they are a tool that we will use in our assessment if it's deemed necessary based on our overall assessment of the quality management system for that site. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson-Lee. And I think we have time for one last question. So if a company submits CMC information as part of the pre-EUA interaction, do they need to resubmit it as part of the formal EUA submission?
So I can tell you what I know that the assessors will say in terms of just for ease of review, it's always easier to have everything all together in one document or one submission. That being said, if it causes an undue burden to the company, to the sponsor for the EUA, you can absolutely cross-reference previously submitted information. You would just need to make sure that you can clearly identify for us where that information is located, such as the submission type, whether it was a correspondence, part of a meeting package, the date of submission, and down to the detail of page numbers if you're able to get that granular, and helping to point us in the right direction. So we do understand that for some folks that might be a little bit of a challenge to resubmit all of that information. And so we are open to cross-referencing previously submitted information. And again, I would encourage you to come in and talk to us prior to your formal EUA submission so that we can kind of lay out a map for that plan if that is going to be part of your strategy. Thanks for the question.
Great, and thank you so much, Dr. Wilson-Lee, for your presentation and for taking time to answer these questions. And with that, I'm going to pass